6 former assistants, 1 legendary novelist, 1 final dinner. She had spent her entire life turning other people's pain into literature. That night, she planned to do it one last time. But before she could reveal the final chapter, she collapsed at the table.
Prologue: The Dinner. By the time the first guest arrived, the house already felt staged. Not decorated, not prepared, staged. Edward Hale would only understand the difference much later, when the evening had already ended in death and half the city had begun repeating the wrong version of events. But if anyone had stood in the doorway at 7:30 that night and looked closely enough, the truth was already there. Not in the food, not in the guests, not even in the woman who had invited them, but in the way every room seemed to anticipate an audience that had not yet entered. The house belonged to Vivian Voss, and houses like hers were always described the same way by magazines that needed language to sound more expensive than the furniture. Iconic, eclectic, uncompromising. A mind-made architecture, which was a decorative way of saying that the place looked less like a home than like the inside of a long and very successful argument with the world. It stood on a hill above the city, white stone and black steel against the dark autumn sky, all sharp glass angles and carefully lit pathways. The front gate opened automatically, but not generously. Everything in the house suggested the same principle. You might be allowed in, but you would never mistake that for warmth. Inside, the dining room had been arranged with mathematical cruelty. 7 places at the table, 7 water glasses, 7 folded name cards written in hand in black ink, so elegant it seemed designed to humiliate anyone whose own handwriting still looked human. At the head of the table, where a host might ordinarily sit to welcome and absorb the room, Vivian had chosen the opposite strategy. Her chair was not at the end. It was set halfway down the long side of the table, facing the windows, where she could watch every face without appearing to preside. That, too, had been deliberate. Everything with Vivian Voss was deliberate. For 40 years, she had built a career out of turning human weakness into literature and literature into power. She wrote difficult novels about brilliant, damaged people destroying one another with intelligence, restraint, and excellent posture. Critics loved her because she made cruelty look like observation. Readers loved her because she said the quiet parts out loud and charged hardcovers for the privilege. Interviewers feared her for the simpler reason that she remembered everything and forgave almost nothing. She had also gone through assistants the way weather went through seasons. Young editors, researchers, secretaries, personal aides, fact-checkers, graduate students too dazzled or desperate to refuse the chance to work for her. They arrived eager, over-prepared, and slightly afraid. Most left exhausted, publicly gracious, privately furious, and professionally reshaped in ways they would not understand until years later. Some had lasted months. One had lasted nearly 3 years. None of them had remained in her life. Until tonight. Tonight, Vivian had invited all 6 surviving former assistants to dinner. The invitation had been short. 1 evening only. No press, no partners, no excuses. I have finished my final novel. You are all in it. Come eat with the dead before they are printed. No one had mistaken it for kindness, and yet every one of them had come. The first to arrive was Daniel Mercer at exactly 7:38. He came alone in a dark coat, carrying the kind of uncertainty that middle-aged men wore badly. Daniel was once Vivian's research assistant back when she was writing historical fiction with enough archival precision to frighten librarians. He had lasted 11 months before leaving with what he later described, in one interview and 3 drunken conversations, as a doctorate in emotional triage. He now taught literature at a respectable university and acquired the manner of a man who knew how to sound calm in seminar rooms while being quietly furious in private. The housekeeper took his coat.
Vivian did not come to greet him. That, too, was deliberate.
He was shown into the drawing room where a fire burned low beneath a wall of shelves filled with first editions, foreign translations, framed letters, and the trophies of a life spent being right in public. Daniel stood with a glass of wine he had not asked for and looked around the room like a witness trying not to appear relevant. The second guest arrived 6 minutes later. Clara Weiss had been Vivian's personal assistant during the years when the novelist's fame became wealth and her private life became negotiation. Clara was elegant in the way some people become elegant only after surviving someone else's standards. Her dress was simple, dark, expensive, and selected with the precision of a woman who understood rooms before she entered them. She and Daniel exchanged the stiff, over-civilized smile of people who share a battlefield but not a friendship. Then came Owen Hart, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, carrying his own weather into the room. Owen had once managed Vivian's schedules, public appearances, contracts, and travel. The practical one, the fixer, the man who knew where the bodies would have been buried if the books had sold less well. He had not spoken to Vivian in 7 years. After him, Mira Solberg, younger than the others, sharper in the eyes, a successful essayist now, and one of the very few people who had ever publicly accused Vivian Voss of theft. Not financial theft, worse, moral theft. Mira had claimed in print that Vivian cannibalized the inner lives of people around her and published the remains as prose. The literary world had loved the scandal because it sounded true and expensive. The fifth guest was Elias Rowe, who arrived with the tension of a man who had almost turned his car around twice and still regretted not doing it. Elias had been Vivian's final full-time assistant and the only one to leave without publicly praising her afterward. He now ghost-wrote memoirs for politicians and disgraced executives, professional work for a man with a face that had learned the cost of silence. The sixth and last former assistant arrived at 8:13. Julia Vale had been the youngest when she worked for Vivian, and, if gossip was accurate, the one most nearly destroyed by it. Once she had been introduced in magazine profiles as the prodigy at Voss's side. Later, she had vanished from publishing almost entirely, resurfacing only recently as the co-founder of a boutique archival consultancy for literary estates. She entered the drawing room with the composure of someone who had spent years assembling herself from spare parts and resented being summoned back into anyone else's narrative. 6 former assistants, 6 histories of injury, 6 versions of the same old magnetism pulling against resentment. And then, finally, Vivian herself entered the room. She did not appear frail. That was the first disappointment she inflicted on anyone hoping age had softened her. She wore black silk and a narrow silver bracelet at her wrist. Her hair, now entirely white, had been cut shorter than in the photographs on her dust jackets, which gave her face a sharper clarity rather than diminishing it. She walked with a cane, but lightly, as if the cane were more punctuation than necessity. Her eyes moved across the room once, taking inventory not of bodies, but of effects. Good. You all came anyway. No one answered immediately. Vivian smiled.
That was the correct choice, she added. If anyone else had said it, the line would have sounded absurd. From Vivian, it sounded like memory. Dinner began at 8:30. There were no servants in the room once the courses were laid out. Another deliberate choice. No witnesses who were not already implicated by history. The food was excellent in the way money made excellence inevitable. It arrived quietly, vanished quietly, and would have been remembered by no one if the evening had ended differently. The conversation, however, was bad from the beginning, and Vivian seemed relieved by that. She did not want nostalgia. She wanted structure. "So," she said after the first course, lifting her wine but not drinking, "which of you still tells people I ruined your life?"
Daniel exhaled through his nose. Owen looked at his plate. Mira smiled without kindness. Julia reached for her water glass. Only Clara answered. "Do we take turns?" she asked, "or are you still editing us in real time?" Vivian laughed once, quietly. "Yes," she said, "that's closer to the tone I was hoping for." And there it was, the old power. Not charm, never charm, something more efficient. The ability to make a room feel that cruelty, correctly timed, was evidence of intelligence rather than failure. They ate. They drank. They said things they had practiced not saying for years. Daniel accused Vivian of rewriting history in both novels and memory. Mira accused her of theft. Owen accused her of treating loyalty as a temporary clerical function. Julia said almost nothing, which made Vivian watch her more than the others. And Clara, who had clearly rehearsed this dinner in private long before the invitation arrived, struck hardest and most politely, asking whether Vivian had invited them here because she felt guilt or because she had confused guilt with copyright. Vivian loved that one. "Neither," she said. "I invited you because the book is finished." No one moved. Even then, before the phrase became fatal, the room shifted. "The final novel?" Daniel asked. Vivian nodded. "My last one," she said. "I am old, inconveniently alive, and no longer interested in pretending that fiction deserves innocence." Mira set down her fork. "You used us again." "Oh, Mira, of course I used you. That was the only reason any of you were ever useful." Owen muttered something under his breath. Clara closed her eyes briefly. Julia looked up for the first time in several minutes, and Elias, quiet, careful Elias, finally spoke. "What exactly is in the book?" Vivian turned her head toward him. The pause before she answered was small but not natural. It was chosen, a writer's pause, a line break made audible. "Enough," she said, "to make publication inconvenient for at least one person in this room." No one breathed for half a second. Then Vivian lifted a stack of paper from the chair beside her and laid it on the table. A manuscript, printed, annotated, held together with a black clip. Its title page faced downward. They didn't need to. Its presence had already changed the meal. Daniel tried to laugh. "That's theatrical, even for you." Vivian looked at him. "It is," she said. "I find endings demand discipline." The storm began outside around 9:40. At first it was only rain against the windows, visible in the reflection of the dining room lights. Then wind, then thunder far enough away to seem decorative. The penthouse did not shake, of course, but its atmosphere changed. Windows became mirrors. The city beyond them dissolved into scattered light. Vivian appeared to enjoy this. She began reading aloud.
Not the manuscript. Fragments, sentences, observations, little sharp things torn from the book and dropped into the room like glass. A woman who mistakes endurance for morality. Mira's jaw tightened. A man who makes himself useful so he can avoid making himself visible. Owen stopped eating. A clever academic who confuses interpretation with courage. Daniel looked directly at her now. A loyal subordinate who survives by becoming stylistically invisible. Clara did not blink. And then, to Julia, nothing. Vivian skipped her entirely. That, more than anything else, seemed to disturb the room. "Why no line for Julia?" Daniel asked. Vivian smiled faintly. "Because some people are more dangerous in omission," she said.
Julia's hand tightened around her glass. Elias had gone very still. Edward Hale, hours later, watching the dining room footage in slow motion, would mark that exact moment, the point at which one person in the room stopped reacting like a former assistant and started calculating like a defendant. But for now, the others only felt what all intelligent people feel too late, the sense that the conversation had stopped being social and become evidentiary. Dessert was never served. At 10:03, the lights flickered once. A small thing, harmless, the kind of fluctuation expensive houses are not supposed to have and therefore make people notice more than they should. Owen looked toward the ceiling. "Generator?" he asked. The housekeeper appeared briefly at the door and assured them everything was fine. Storm-related instability, backup power active, nothing to worry about. Vivian waved her away. "Sit down," she told the room, though no one had stood. The manuscript remained beside her plate. The storm pressed harder against the glass. "Perhaps," Vivian said, "we should skip to the final chapter." No one answered. She placed one hand on the paper. "It ends with a dinner, naturally. I'm old, not unskilled." Daniel laughed once, hollowly. "Of course it does." Vivian looked around the table. "One of the guests realizes," she said, "that the hostess has already understood everything. Not the ordinary bitterness, not the plagiarism, not the manipulations, not the little ambitions, something older, more expensive." Her eyes moved, one face to the next. "One of the guests understands," she repeated, "that publication would not merely embarrass them, it would end what remains of their life." The room had become utterly still. Even the storm seemed to wait. Then Vivian laid her fingertips on the top page and smiled, not kindly, not victoriously, but with the satisfaction of a woman who believed she had reached the last page before anyone else in the room had even understood the genre. And then she died. It happened so quickly that at first no one was certain what they had seen. Vivian's hand jerked once, lightly, almost irritably. Her gaze shifted away from the manuscript and toward the center of the table, as if some detail had offended her. The wine glass near her elbow tipped and rolled, staining the white linen dark. Her body folded, not dramatically, but efficiently, one shoulder striking the edge of the chair before she slid sideways to the floor, with the cane clattering after her.
For one full second, no one moved. Then all six did at once. Daniel stood so suddenly, his chair crashed backward. Clara shouted Vivian's name. Owen came around the table first, moving with the reflexes of someone who had spent years responding before others finished panicking. Mira stepped back. Julia froze. Elias did not. He moved toward the fallen manuscript. Only a step, only half a gesture, but enough. Then he stopped, because the others were already there, because Vivian was on the floor, because death had a way of reorganizing etiquette faster than any host ever could. "Call emergency services," Clara said. "They're already on their way," Owen snapped back, though he had not yet made the call. Daniel was kneeling now, hand at Vivian's neck, face pale. "There's no pulse." The housekeeper returned. The storm hammered the glass. The manuscript sat on the table, wet at one edge with spilled wine. And somewhere inside the impossible density of that moment, one of six former assistants understood the same thing Edward Hale would understand later. Vivian Voss had not planned her death. She had planned a revelation. But she had made the oldest mistake a brilliant person can make. She had mistaken control of the story for control of the room. When the police arrived, the house was still locked, not by design, by weather and distance and the architecture of expensive isolation. No one had left. No one had entered. The six former assistants remained in the dining room, each already beginning the private work of rearranging memory around survival.
The manuscript was collected, the glasses were bagged, the table photographed, Vivian's body removed. And before midnight, one rumor had already begun spreading through the city's literary circles that the famous novelist had died at a dinner she herself had orchestrated, seated among the 6 people she had once trained, humiliated, used, and finally invited back for one final act. By morning, a second rumor emerged. The final manuscript, unfinished, acidic, and dangerously specific, appeared to describe a murder before it happened. That was when the police called Edward Hale, not because the death was impossible, because the room was too full of intention, and because, as one exhausted inspector put it over the phone, either she wrote her own ending or someone in that house edited it for her. Edward looked down at the address they had sent him, then at the weather breaking over the river outside his office window. A dinner with 6 former assistants, a dead novelist, a manuscript that knew too much. He closed the file once, reopened it, and smiled faintly. Because some people built locked rooms with steel and glass, Vivian Voss had built hers with memory, resentment, and the vanity of believing everyone would wait politely until she reached the final sentence. She had been wrong, and somewhere in that house Edward already knew the real last chapter had not been written by the dead woman on the floor. It had been written by the only person at the table who understood that stories were safest when their author could no longer revise them.
Chapter 1. The Table. Edward Hale arrived at the house at 7:18 the following morning when expensive properties still looked innocent. Night had a way of flattering architecture, storms even more so. The house on the hill, with its black glass and white stone and sharp theatrical geometry, had probably looked magnificent during the dinner, illuminated, reflective, severe, the sort of place designed by a person who thought comfort was for the unedited. In the morning light, however, the building looked less like a monument and more like a decision. That interested Edward. Houses built by decorators revealed taste. Houses built by their owners revealed motive. A police vehicle stood near the gate. Another was parked halfway down the drive. The storm had broken during the night, leaving behind a rinsed sky and the faint mineral smell of wet stone warming under pale sun. An officer opened the door before Edward reached it. He had expected that too. In cases involving famous people, the living were always waiting before the dead finished cooling. Detective Inspector Lena Ashcroft met him in the entry hall. She was tall, composed, and looked like a woman who had slept badly but refused to let the fatigue become public. Edward had never worked with her before, though he knew the type immediately: practical, intelligent, and deeply unimpressed by literary celebrity. Her suit was dark, her notebook thin, her expression already 10 steps ahead of the people she had spent the night interviewing. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Inspector." She glanced toward the dining room beyond the corridor. "You've read the preliminary file." "I have." "And?" Edward looked past her at the long strip of morning light on the floor. "And I think everyone in this house is already telling the truth," he said. Ashcroft raised an eyebrow. "That's optimistic." Edward shook his head. "Not quite. They're telling the truth as they needed to have been." That earned him the smallest possible smile, a professional one, brief and not yet expensive. She led him toward the dining room. "Cause of death is pending," she said. "No obvious violence, no stab wound, no gunshot, no signs of strangulation. Medical examiner found no immediate physical trauma other than the fall from the chair. Toxicology is underway. The 6 guests are still available, though their lawyers are beginning to orbit. The manuscript has been bagged. The glasses have been collected. The staff were limited to the kitchen and service hall. No one external entered after the dinner began." "And before it began?" She glanced at him. "That's one of several things I hoped you'd like." They entered the dining room. The room still held the shape of the previous night, the way certain people held resentment, in arrangement, not expression. The table remained where it had been, though the body was gone.
Evidence markers stood in its place like punctuation marks left after the sentence had been removed. Sunlight entered through the immense windows now that the storm had passed, flattening the previous night's atmosphere into something less romantic and therefore more useful. Edward stopped just inside the room and did not approach the table immediately. Rooms told the truth fastest when no one interrupted them. The first thing Edward noticed was not where Vivian Voss had died, it was where she had intended to be seen. Her chair remained halfway down the long side of the table, exactly as described in the report, positioned not for conventional hosting, but for surveillance. From that seat, she could watch every face without seating the windows or the room's visual center. It was not the seat of a hostess, it was the seat of an editor. The difference mattered. A hostess gathered a room, an editor arranged it so that people betrayed themselves in sequence. Edward began walking slowly around the table.
7 settings, 7 water glasses, 7 wine glasses, 7 small plates for the dessert course that never happened. The linen had been removed overnight and replaced with protective paper to preserve residue and placement, but the arrangement underneath had been measured, photographed, numbered. He saw where Daniel Mercer's chair had fallen backward, where Owen Hart had come around the table, where Clara Weiss had remained seated for the first half-second too long, perhaps out of shock, perhaps out of training, where Mira Solberg's retreat had put her nearest the sideboard, and where Julia Vale had, according to witness accounts, frozen. Frozen was an unhelpful word. People who froze always moved. The problem was that no one watched where. Edward stopped at Vivian's place. The chair had been righted, but the evidence marker remained on the floor where her shoulder had struck before she slid down. Her cane stood propped against the wall now, another item turned into evidence by proximity rather than intention. Her wine glass had broken when it fell. A second glass, the water glass, had not. He crouched and looked at the outline of the stemware positions marked in tape. "Which one did she drink from more?" he asked. Ashcroft checked the notes. "Wine. The water was nearly untouched." He nodded. "And the manuscript?" She gestured to a separate evidence table near the doorway. "Bagged. We have photographs before removal." Edward stood and crossed to it. The manuscript sat inside a clear sleeve, thick and professionally clipped, the top right corner of the stack faintly stained by red wine that had spread through several pages before drying. The first page still faced downward exactly as described. Edward looked at the bag, then at Ashcroft. "No one turned the title page during the dinner?" "Not according to any witness." "Do you believe them?" She considered. "I believe none of them remember the page as well as they think they do." "Good." He did not ask to open the bag yet, not because he didn't want to read it, but because reading it first would make the mistake all literary crimes wanted investigators to make, treating the text like the body. Manuscripts lie differently. Better to begin with furniture. He returned to the table and considered the placements. Ashcroft handed him a printed seating diagram. Vivian midway along the west side, facing the windows. To her immediate right, Clara Weiss. To her immediate left, Elias Rowe. Across from Vivian, on the east side, slightly offset, Daniel Mercer. At one end, Owen Hart. At the other, Mira Solberg. Julia Vale nearest the windows on the far side, with a direct oblique view of Vivian's hand and the manuscript, but not of Elias's lap or Daniel's lower body under the table. Edward looked up. "Who chose the seating?" Ashcroft replied. "Name cards were handwritten by Vivian. Housekeeper confirms they were already in place before guests arrived." "Did anyone swap?" "No." "Did anyone object?" Daniel Mercer joked that he had been put in the lecture position. Clara Weiss said Vivian had seated them according to old sins. No one moved the cards. Edward nodded. There it was again. The dead woman arranging the room before the living began acting. Clever people loved premeditated symmetry because it made spontaneity look suspect. He walked to Daniel Mercer's place first. The chair had been put back, but bore a slight scrape against the floor where it had gone over backward. His glassware sat nearest a dish of untouched figs and a small knife intended for fruit. Edward looked at the knife. "Tested?" "Clean," Ashcroft said. "And theatrical." He nodded. "Those are not mutually exclusive." He moved on. Clara Weiss's place was more orderly than the others, even after the interruption of death. Her napkin had been folded back into itself rather than discarded. Her dessert spoon remained parallel to the plate. Women like Clara were often underestimated by people who mistook visible composure for moral tidiness. Edward looked at her line of sight from the chair. From here, she would have had an almost perfect view of Vivian's profile, glass, and right hand, but a weaker view of Elias, who sat too close to the dead woman and too near the storm-dark window reflection that would have turned certain motions into shadow.
Clara claims she saw Vivian's hand twitch before the glass tipped, Ashcroft said. Edward did not turn. And who claims something different? Daniel says the glass moved first. Owen says he was looking at Vivian's face, not the hand. Mira says she looked away during the flicker of the lights and only looked back at the sound of the chair. Julia says she saw Vivian reach toward the manuscript. Elias says Vivian's hand was already on the manuscript. Edward finally looked at her. That's 7 people and 8 versions. 6 guests, Ashcroft corrected. Not quite. The dead count as a witness if they prepared enough of the room. This time the smile lasted a heartbeat longer. He moved to Elias Rowe's chair. There was nothing outwardly special about the place setting, which made it immediately interesting. People who planned to commit murder at dinner rarely poisoned only one thing. They poisoned attention first. Elias, according to the file, had been the quiet one, the former assistant who had moved one step toward the manuscript after Vivian collapsed. Every witness mentioned it, though not one of them could explain why they had noticed that specific gesture amid the confusion. Edward knew why. Human beings watched motion toward meaning faster than motion toward danger. A hand moving toward a dead woman's pages would always register more sharply than a hand moving away from a glass. He crouched slightly and looked beneath the edge of the table. The chairs were upholstered in dark leather. The underside of the table was polished walnut. No obvious attachments, no chewing gum theatrics, no taped object, no hidden syringes, none of the vulgar solutions crime writers invented when they became impatient with people. Good. This case deserved intelligence. Ashcroft watched him. You have a thought. I have a prejudice. Against whom? Against dead novelists. That surprised a laugh out of her before she could stop it. He straightened. Vivian Voss wanted this room to become readable after her death. That means she either expected violence, expected confession, or expected to control the emotional weather so precisely that she mistook provocation for authorship. Ashcroft looked at the manuscript bag. She invited all 6 of them. Yes. Knowing one of them might react? More than that, hoping one of them would. Ashcroft folded her arms. Then we're not dealing with an ordinary victim. Edward shook his head. No, ordinary victims don't arrange witnesses by angle. He crossed to Julia Vale's place near the windows. From here, the city would have been visible before the storm thickened into reflection. During the dinner, however, the glass would have turned mirror dark, folding the room back into itself. Edward looked at the window and then at the chair again. Who saw Elias move toward the manuscript? Ashcroft checked her notes. Julia first, then Mira after Julia gasped. Julia was looking at him, so it seems. Why? Ashcroft shrugged. History. Edward nodded, the useful answer, meaning she didn't know yet. He appreciated that. He remained at Julia's chair and reconstructed the room. Vivian speaking, manuscript on table, storm at windows, power flicker, half-second of environmental disruption. In such moments, people always looked in one of 3 directions: upward toward the lights, outward toward the windows, inward toward the face that mattered. Which face mattered to Julia when the lights flickered? Not Vivian's, perhaps, not if omission had already marked her as uniquely dangerous. She might have been watching Elias before anyone else knew to notice. Edward turned away from the table entirely and surveyed the room. A sideboard held the remnants of service, emptied serving platters removed, but decanters, salt, candle stubs, and coffee service still photographed in place overnight before collection. There was a door to the service corridor on the north wall, another to the drawing room beyond, one to the main hall. The room was not locked in the classic sense, but it was socially sealed, staff absent, guests seated, house isolated by distance and weather. A country house murder without a country, which is to say, a modern version of the same old vanity.
"Bring me the staff statements again," he said. Ashcroft handed him another set of pages. Housekeeper, served first course, second course, cleared plates, observed increasing hostility, was sent away by Vivian shortly before dessert. Cook, remained in kitchen, heard no scream, only crash. Driver, left after final guest arrival. Security system, no one entered or exited between 2011 and emergency vehicle arrival after 2210, apart from one brief opening to the service terrace earlier in the evening by staff. Earlier in the evening. Edward stopped reading. What was this? Ashcroft looked. Service terrace access, 1952. Housekeeper says she opened it to speak with the florist about damaged arrangements after the storm warning. How long open? 47 seconds. Edward nodded. Did anyone go through? No clear footage, exterior camera partially obscured by rain. He handed the statement back. That may be nothing. Ashcroft studied him. And literary houses love nothing. It lets them add mood. She let that pass. He returned his attention to the table and finally asked the question she had been expecting. The glasses, were all 7 tested individually? Yes. And? Nothing obvious yet, no classic fast-acting poison on initial screening. Toxicology wanted deeper analysis of Vivian's wine and the residue from her plate. We'll have more this afternoon. Edward nodded. That was useful and annoying in equal measure. Fast answers made bad cases. Slow chemistry made honest ones. He approached Vivian's chair again and imagined the moment. Her hand on the manuscript, her line about the final chapter, the satisfaction in the room peaking at the exact second control became public. Then death. No scream, no dramatic plea, no reaching for throat, no convulsion described by witnesses, only one jerk, one spill, one collapse. That suggested one of 2 broad categories, an internal event that arrived like a switch or a substance elegant enough to appear internal. With Vivian, elegance would have appealed to the killer as much as success. Ashcroft broke the silence. You're not asking who inherited. Not yet. You should know anyway. The literary estate is substantial. House, rights, archive, unpublished work. And the manuscript? Left to the estate executor pending publication review. Who is the executor? She watched him carefully now, as if choosing whether to enjoy the answer. Julia Vale. Edward looked at her. Of course she is. Ashcroft nodded. There's more. A codicil to Vivian's will was signed 3 months ago. Julia's archival consultancy becomes temporary custodian of all working papers until a biographer or institutional buyer is chosen. He looked back at Julia's chair. There it was, the first large distortion in the room. Everyone would assume money, revenge, humiliation, theft of secrets. But literary people often murdered over control of text more readily than over cash. Cash was vulgar and divisible. Manuscripts offered the cleaner intoxication of narrative ownership. If Julia inherited the papers, then Vivian had not merely omitted her at dinner. She had elevated her elsewhere, deliberately, publicly, perhaps privately too. Dangerous. Very dangerous. And who knows this? Edward asked. All 6 knew by dessert. He turned. How? Vivian told them. Of course she did.
Ashcroft's voice remained dry. She apparently enjoyed disclosure. Only when she controlled the sequencing. He walked toward the evidence table and finally asked to see the manuscript images. Ashcroft handed him a tablet containing the scene photographs. He scrolled through them, title page down, Vivian's hand on the stack, wine glass at right elbow, pages clipped firmly. One image caught his attention, earlier than the others, taken by a staff member before dinner, perhaps, or sent to the florist or caterer. The manuscript sat beside Vivian's place already, and beneath it, barely visible at the lower edge, was a second, thinner sheaf of paper, not under the whole manuscript, under only part of it, enough to elevate one side by a few millimeters. Edward enlarged the image. "What happened to this?" Ashcroft leaned in. "To what?" He pointed.
There, under the stack. She frowned. Could be a menu card, could be nothing. We didn't recover anything separate. Edward swiped to later images. Gone. In the photographs after death, the manuscript sat flat. "That," he said softly, "is better." Ashcroft looked at him. "Better?" "Yes, nothing that disappears from a murder table is ever trivial." He zoomed again. The hidden papers were too blurred to read, but not too blurred to exist. Someone had removed something from beneath the manuscript between pre-dinner staging and post-mortem evidence collection. Or Vivian had, which was nearly the same problem phrased with better posture. Ashcroft watched him think. "You have that look again." "What look?" "The one that means the room has offended you." Edward handed the tablet back. "It has. Too many people are telling me what the manuscript meant. Not enough for telling me what was under it." He stepped to the center of the room and turned once more, taking in every angle as if memorizing a stage before the actors returned. The first major imbalance in the case now stood cleanly in his mind. Not the death itself, not yet. The imbalance was social, and therefore more durable than blood. Vivian had invited 6 former assistants to dinner, and then, by her own admission, implied that publication would ruin at least one of them. She had omitted Julia publicly while making Julia privately powerful. She had seated Elias close enough to look guilty if he breathed incorrectly. She had put Clara in a line of sight favorable to precise observation, Daniel in the lecture position, Owen at the practical axis of the table, where a man could intervene fastest, Mira where retreat would be visible. In other words, she had built not a dinner, but a diagram, and one detail in that diagram had not belonged to her final plan, the missing paper beneath the manuscript. He looked at Ashcroft. "Interview them again." "We have. Not about their grievances, about the title page." She raised an eyebrow. "The page no one claims to have turned?" He nodded. "Yes, ask each of them the same thing. Before Vivian began the final speech, before the flicker, before the collapse, before panic, what exactly did they believe was on the first page beneath her hand? A title, a dedication, a chapter heading, or another sheet entirely?" Ashcroft considered this. "You think one of them noticed the extra paper? I think one of them removed it. The rest may only remember the absence and call it atmosphere." He took one last slow look at the table. The room was ready now, not solved, but open. The furniture had done what furniture in good houses often did after violence. It had exhausted style and become structure, which meant the next stage could begin. "Who do you want first?" Ashcroft asked. Edward's gaze moved to Elias's chair, then Julia's, then back to Vivian's. "Clara Weiss," he said. "Why Clara?" "Because careful people see more than they volunteer." He started toward the door, then stopped and added after that, "And bring me the housekeeper after that. I want to know whether Vivian Voss staged the manuscript herself or whether someone helped her set the scene. In rooms like this, murder often begins several hours before the body understands it has been invited. Ashcroft nodded once. And behind them, the table remained exactly where it had been. 7 places, 1 absence, and the first real clue, not in the dead woman's pages, but in the missing page no one had yet admitted existed.
Chapter 2. Clara Weiss. Clara Weiss did not look like a woman who frightened easily. Edward Hale noticed that before she sat down. Inspector Ashcroft had arranged the interview in the smaller morning room overlooking the east garden, a space the house seemed to regard as less important than the dining room, and therefore, by the logic of expensive properties, more honest. The walls were lined with pale books no one had read for pleasure. The chairs were upholstered in muted gray, and the windows let in a thin, washed light that made fatigue visible without making it dramatic. Clara entered wearing the same dark clothes from the night before, though now they had been pressed, adjusted, and restored to the sort of order that announced not composure, but decision. She greeted Ashcroft with the bare minimum of civility. She greeted Edward with recognition. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I was told you don't waste time." Edward gestured toward the chair opposite him. "I try not to let other people waste it for me." That earned him the faintest hint of approval. Not warmth. Clara Weiss seemed built from the kind of intelligence that mistrusted warmth on principle. She sat, crossed one leg over the other, placed both hands on the armrests, and looked not nervous, but prepared, which was useful. Prepared people always left fingerprints in their answers because they had polished them too carefully. Ashcroft remained near the fireplace, notebook open, contributing silence rather than interruption. Edward began gently. "You worked for Vivian Voss for how long?" 2 years and 4 months. "Longer than most." "Because I was useful," Clara said, "not because she liked me." Edward nodded. What did usefulness mean to Vivian? Clara considered. That I could remember 10 things at once, organize 20, and take the blame for 30 without crying in hallways. Did you ever cry in hallways? Not where she could hear it. Good, Edward thought, not because the line was sharp, but because it was true without performance. Clara's voice remained controlled, but she was not self-consciously literary. That made her more valuable than the others would be, at least at first. You came to the dinner expecting what? A provocation, not reconciliation? Clara smiled once, very thinly. Vivian believed reconciliation was what lesser people called a narrative failure. Edward let that settle. And the manuscript? She wanted us to know it existed. She wanted more than that, Edward said. Clara's gaze shifted slightly, acknowledging the correction. Yes, she said, she wanted us to know it had already won. Edward leaned back. That's an interesting choice of word. It's the right one. Clara looked toward the window for a moment, then back at him. People like Vivian don't invite former assistants to dinner for nostalgia. They invite them to control the terms of memory. Edward did not smile, though he agreed. And did she? For most of the evening, Clara replied, yes. The answer came too quickly to be ornamental. That interested him. For most of the evening, he repeated. When did that change? Clara looked at him for a long second. She understood the question immediately, which meant she had already asked it of herself. When she stopped speaking like a novelist, she said. Ashcroft looked up from her notes. Edward did not move. Meaning? Clara uncrossed and recrossed her legs, a small sign that tension lived underneath the composure after all. Vivian always performed intelligence, she said, even in private, especially in private. The cruelty was often genuine, but the staging around it was curated. Last night, until the final 10 minutes, she was still doing that. She was reading the room, controlling pace, allowing each of us enough rope to feel implicated. And then, Clara said quietly, She sounded like a woman who had finally decided to stop hiding one specific fact. Edward let the silence after that answer lengthen slightly, not to be theatrical, to see whether Clara would fill it. She did. She had been hinting all evening about betrayal, theft, ambition, concealment. Those were familiar territories with Vivian. She liked broad accusations because they made everyone in the room helpfully guilty. But near the end, the tone narrowed. It became personal. To whom?
Clara's eyes held his. To Elias. Ashcroft did not speak, but Edward could feel the change in the room. Why Elias? Because she looked at him differently. Clara hesitated. Not more often, more specifically. That was a good answer. The kind people gave when they had truly observed something rather than retrofitted it after panic. Edward nodded once. What did you see? She was speaking to all of us, but landing sentences on him. There's a difference. Writers do it in public all the time. Throw the paragraph broadly, aim the final clause at one face. She did that repeatedly toward the end. Did Elias react? Less than Daniel, less than Mira, which is one reason I noticed. Edward folded his hands. The quiet one drew attention by not reacting. Yes. Then, why didn't you say so in your first statement? Clara's mouth tightened slightly. Because your first statement to the police is always about surviving the first hour. Accuracy comes later. Honest again. Good. Edward changed direction without warning. What was on the title page? Clara blinked once. There it was, the smallest disruption so far. I beg your pardon? The manuscript, Edward said. The first page, before Vivian collapsed. What do you believe was on it? Clara did not answer immediately. Her face remained composed, but the pause was not the pause of a person retrieving memory. It was the pause of a person deciding whether memory could safely be admitted. I didn't read it, she said. That wasn't my question. She looked at him sharply. I know. Edward waited. Clara inhaled once shallowly. The title page was face down. Yes. But there was another sheet underneath. Edward did not move. Ashcroft's pen stopped. Go on. Clara looked toward the door, then back. It wasn't obvious unless you were looking from my angle. The top stack sat slightly unevenly. Not much, a few millimeters. Enough that I assumed Vivian had placed a note underneath. What kind of note? I don't know. What did you think at the time? Clara gave the smallest of bitter laughs. I thought it was typical Vivian, something she planned to reveal dramatically, a dedication, perhaps, or the name of whoever she meant to destroy. Edward nodded. And after she fell? Clara's expression changed almost imperceptibly. It was gone. That answer came too cleanly, too directly. He did not trust it yet, but he respected it enough to proceed. You saw it disappear? No. You noticed its absence? Yes. When? Clara did not hesitate this time. When Daniel shouted that there was no pulse. Edward watched her. Not when she fell? No. When she fell, everyone moved badly. Badly.
Clara looked at him as if the word should have been obvious. People like us aren't built for emergency. We are built for interpretation. It's not the same thing. That, too, was probably true. So when did you look at the manuscript? When Owen came around the table, Daniel was kneeling. Mira had stepped backward. Julia was still seated. Elias... She stopped. Yes? Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. She knew the trap was small and elegant and had already stepped into it. Elias was standing. Near what? The table. Near what on the table? The manuscript. Edward let that answer breathe. And what was his hand doing? Clara looked displeased now, not at the question, but at the accuracy required by it. I don't know. You saw him move toward it. Yes. You did not see what his hand did. No. Why not? Because Vivian was dying. Was she? The question landed harder than he intended, and she took it that way. Good. What do you mean? I mean, Edward said quietly, that once Daniel declared there was no pulse, everyone in the room behaved as though the death had already become narrative. I'm asking what happened in the few seconds before that. Clara stared at him. She understood. More importantly, she understood why it mattered. I looked at Vivian first, then at Daniel, then at Elias. In that order? Yes. And Julia. Clara frowned slightly. Julia was watching Elias. Ashcroft's pen moved again. Edward kept his tone neutral. You're sure? Yes. How? Because she wasn't looking at Vivian when the others moved. She was looking across the table. At Elias. Yes. He nodded slowly. That aligned with the geometry of the room and with his earlier prejudice about attention. Good. Why would Julia watch Elias? Clara's expression went carefully blank. People did that when they knew more than they had intended to admit in a first interview. Because they used to be close, she said. How close? I don't know. Try. Clara looked briefly annoyed, then resigned. Not romantically, she said. Not in the obvious sense, but they were aligned once. During the later years, they understood Vivian similarly. That can be more intimate than sex. Ashcroft's pen moved again. Edward shifted again, lightly. What did you think Vivian meant when she said publication would end what remained of one person's life? Clara's answer surprised him. I thought it meant me. He did not react outwardly. Why? Because I handled more of her private life than the others did. Appointments, medical schedules, correspondence, contracts that never became public. If she had decided to write without discretion, I had the broadest exposure. You thought she was threatening revelation. She was, but not Elias. Clara's eyes moved away for the first time. I said the tone narrowed. I didn't say I was certain of the target. A subtle retreat. Understandable. Edward nodded once and altered his line of attack. The power flicker. Yes. Where did you look? Up. Then at Vivian. Not at the windows? No. Not at the manuscript? No. Not at Elias? Clara exhaled softly. No, not immediately. There, the correction had appeared by itself. So you looked at Elias later? Yes. How much later? A second, maybe less. Long enough to see whether the paper remained beneath the stack? Clara's jaw tightened. Possibly. Long enough to see whether Elias had removed it? I did not see him remove anything. That wasn't my question. This time she did not hide her irritation. Then ask the question you mean. Edward inclined his head. Fine. Did you form the impression in that second that Elias had just finished doing something rather than merely reacting? Clara held his gaze. Yes.
There it was. Ashcroft said, "Why didn't you say that in your formal statement?" Clara turned toward her. "Because formal statements punish impressions and reward false certainty." Ashcroft's mouth twitched very slightly. She didn't disagree. Edward took another turn. "What about Vivian's glass?" Clara paused. "What about it?" "You said in your first account that her hand twitched before the wine tipped." "Yes." "Are you sure?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because the movement drew my eye." "Which hand?" "Right." "Nearest the wine?" "Yes." "And where was the manuscript?" "Under her right hand, too, or part of it." "Or part of it?" Clara frowned. She had one hand on the pages, but not the whole stack. The top edge was free. Edward went still. "That is not in your statement." "No," Clara said, "because I only became certain of it later." "How much later?" "When I couldn't sleep." He nodded. "Useful answer. People often remembered structure only after shock released the room back into sequence. So Vivian's right hand was touching the manuscript, but not controlling it fully. The top edge remained exposed. Yes, exposed enough for someone beside her to touch? Clara's eyes sharpened instantly. Yes, she said. Who sat beside her? Elias. To the right? Elias on her left. I was on her right. Edward watched her face as he asked the next question. Could you have touched the top edge of the manuscript without standing? Clara answered immediately, yes. Could Elias? Yes. Could Julia? Not without reaching. Daniel? Only if he leaned forward. Owen? Not naturally. Mira? No. Good. Better and better. Now the room was reducing itself the way all staged crimes eventually did, not to motive first, but to reach. Edward stood and moved toward the window, giving her a moment to breathe and perhaps misjudge him. When he spoke again, it was quieter. Did Vivian ever tell you she intended Julia to control the papers? Clara said nothing. He turned back. That is a yes or no question. Yes. When? A month ago. Privately? Yes. What exactly did she say? Clara's expression turned hard in a different way now, not defensive, but tired. She said Julia understood preservation better than the others because she had learned the cost of being edited by someone stronger. That sounded like Vivian, compliment as scalpel. And what did you think she meant? I thought she was rewarding Julia for surviving her. Did you tell anyone? No. Not even Julia?
No, he believed that. Not because Clara was morally superior, but because such knowledge was more useful when hoarded than shared. What did you feel when Vivian announced it at dinner? Annoyed? Only annoyed? Clara smiled without pleasure. If you want the full answer, then no, not only. Surprised, slightly humiliated, curious, also relieved that the target might no longer be me. Edward nodded. Very good. Complexity without theatricality. He trusted it more than most grief. And Elias, he asked, how did he react to the revelation about Julia? Clara thought for the first time rather than merely recalling. He went quiet in a more focused way. That sounds imprecise. It is, because people like Elias build themselves from imprecision. That's how they stay out of books. Edward let that line pass because it was too good to interrupt, and because it told him what he needed. Clara saw Elias not as harmless, but as curated. Ashcroft finally spoke. One more question from me. Did you or did you not see the missing sheet after Vivian collapsed? Clara turned to her, then back to Edward, and answered with deliberate care. I saw that the manuscript sat flatter after she fell than it had before, Edward said. Which means? Which means the extra sheet was no longer there. By then, Edward asked, who had physical access? Clara did not answer immediately. She counted the room again in memory. Daniel rose but went to Vivian. Owen moved around the table. Mira stepped back. Julia remained seated for a second, maybe two. Elias stepped toward the manuscript. I began to stand. So physical access in that exact interval, Elias first, then potentially me, then Daniel if he abandoned Vivian, which he didn't, then anyone else once the room dissolved. There it was, cleanly. Not proof, better, sequence. Edward stood. Thank you, Miss Weiss. Clara did not move. You think Elias took the sheet? I think you want him to have taken it. She stared at him, and for the first time something less controlled crossed her face. Not guilt, offense, which was useful too. That is not the same thing. No, Edward agreed. It rarely is. He glanced at Ashcroft, then back at Clara. One final thing.
When Vivian said the book would end what remained of one person's life, did you think she was bluffing? Clara considered. No, she said. Vivian never bluffed about power. She only exaggerated the elegance with which she intended to use it. Edward nodded. And last night? Clara's answer came quietly. Last night, she thought she had already won. Edward believed that entirely. When Clara had gone, Ashcroft closed her notebook. Well? Edward remained standing by the chair Clara had vacated. He gave us 3 useful things, he said. First, confirmation of the extra sheet. Second, confirmation that the manuscript's upper edge was physically reachable from both Vivian and Elias without either of them standing. Third, Julia was watching Elias before the room knew why. Ashcroft nodded. And the rest? The rest is emotional weather, valuable but unstable. She leaned against the mantel. Do you believe her? In the way one believes careful people, Edward said. She is telling the truth while editing emphasis. Toward Elias? Yes. Ashcroft frowned slightly. You said earlier that everyone in the house is telling the truth as they need it to have been. Edward looked toward the dining room, where the table waited in exact and terrible patience. They are. Clara needs the room to have become dangerous only when Elias recognized himself in the book. That protects her from an older possibility. What older possibility? He turned back to her. That Vivian may have spent the whole evening threatening the wrong person on purpose. Ashcroft absorbed that. You think the extra sheet matters more than the manuscript? Yes. Why? Because a manuscript can accuse a room broadly. A missing sheet usually accuses one person specifically. And if Elias removed it? Edward smiled faintly. Then either it named him, he paused, or it protected someone he preferred not to see named. Ashcroft pushed herself away from the mantel. Who next? Edward looked out toward the corridor. Julia Vale, he said. If Clara is correct, Julia was watching Elias before anyone else knew why. That means 2 things. Either she feared him, he let the sentence finish itself in the room, or she already knew what Vivian intended to reveal. He started toward the door, then stopped. And have someone bring me the pre-dinner household photographs in full resolution. I want every image of that table before the guests sat down. If the dead woman built the scene herself, she may have left us the order of the trap. If someone else staged part of it, they will have done so before the first glass was poured. Ashcroft nodded once. Behind them, the morning room returned to stillness. But the case no longer belonged to the dead novelist's performance alone. It had shifted, as all good investigations do, from spectacle to weight distribution, to who could reach what, who watched whom, and why a single missing sheet under a manuscript began to matter more than the grand, cruel pages on top.
Chapter 3. Julia Vale. Julia Vale did not keep books in visible places. Edward Hale noticed that before she said a word. Inspector Ashcroft had arranged the next interview not in the library, not in the drawing room, and not in the dining room where the architecture of the previous night still exerted too much pressure on memory, but in a smaller sitting room on the west side of the house. It had lower ceilings, fewer windows, softer furniture, and the kind of decorative restraint that wealthy owners used when they wanted a room to feel less like a statement and more like a pause. It was also the first room in the house that seemed to have been chosen for usefulness rather than display. Julia stood by the fireplace when they entered. She had changed clothes, not dramatically, still dark, still expensive, still disciplined, but enough to suggest she was no longer playing the role of summoned guest and had shifted into something else. Her hair, which had looked almost incidental at dinner according to the footage, had been tied back now with practical severity. There was a legal folder on the side table beside her, unopened but not decorative. That interested Edward immediately.
Most people under suspicion preferred to look unprepared. Julia had chosen the opposite. That meant she had either decided honesty was her best defense or had understood before the others that this house was no longer a social scene and had become an estate. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Miss Vale." "I was told you wanted me before the lawyers begin multiplying." Edward inclined his head. That was the hope. Julia sat before anyone offered her a chair. Not arrogance, Edward thought. Efficiency. Women who had once worked as assistants to powerful people usually learned one of two bad habits: perpetual permission-seeking or strategic refusal. Julia belonged clearly to the second category now. Ashcroft remained standing for a moment, then took the chair nearest the window. Edward sat opposite Julia, leaving the low table between them empty except for a carafe of water and 3 untouched glasses. Julia noticed him noticing the glasses. "No one in this house wants a drink offered by anyone else today," she said. Edward allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "That's rational." "No," Julia replied, "it's theatrical. Rational people would simply bring their own." Good, he thought. Better than defensiveness. Julia's intelligence was agile, but not noisy. Vivian must have hated that in ways she could never admit without sounding like a teacher jealous of a student's spine. Edward began without softness. "Vivian Voss made you temporary custodian of her papers." Julia did not blink. "Yes." "You knew before dinner." "Yes." "Did anyone else?" "Not from me." "That wasn't the question." Julia leaned back slightly. "Then ask the question you mean." Ashcroft looked down at her notes to hide the fact that she noticed the line was useful. Edward didn't bother hiding it. "Did you know whether anyone else knew before dinner?" "Yes," Julia said. "Clara knew." "And Elias?" A pause, small but real. "I don't know." Edward watched her closely. "You do know." Julia's mouth tightened very slightly. "I know Vivian told me she had not decided whether to tell the others in advance." "That is not the same answer." "No," Julia said, "it isn't." He let the distinction stand. "Did Vivian want the announcement to provoke a reaction?" Julia gave him a look that bordered on pity. Vivian did not disclose power unless the room was positioned to witness its effect.
That sounded exactly right, but sounding right was not the same thing as being exculpatory. And what effect did it have on you? Julia looked toward the window, not to evade the question, but to choose how much of herself to insult into evidence. "It confirmed something unpleasant," she said. "What?" "That even at the end she still preferred to leave gifts in forms that looked like punishments." Edward nodded. "You didn't want the archive." "I wanted the papers," Julia replied. "I did not want the theater attached to them." "Why the papers?" "Because papers outlive testimony," she said, "and because I know what she destroyed when no one was watching." There it was. Not grief. Damage. Real, old, and sorted into neat drawers. Edward folded his hands. "You founded an archival consultancy." "Yes." "Specializing in literary estates." "Yes." "So Vivian's archive would be professionally valuable." Julia's eyes moved back to him. "Everything in this house is professionally valuable." "That is not the same thing as motive." "No," she agreed. "It's merely the vocabulary people use when they prefer not to say appetite." Ashcroft finally spoke. "Did you have appetite, Miss Vale?" Julia answered without looking at her. "Yes." Edward appreciated the answer. People who admitted appetite often lied less clumsily about its direction. "For control?" he asked. "For preservation," Julia said. "That is often the same thing. Only when handled badly." He changed direction.
You were watching Elias before Vivian fell. Julia's face did not change much, but her stillness sharpened. Clara said that. Was she wrong? No. Why were you watching him? Julia took a slow breath. Because this, Edward thought, was the first answer she had not already fully prepared. Because, before that, Vivian had spent the previous 20 minutes aiming at him, she said. Clara said something similar. Yes, but you were watching him before the others. I notice quiet changes faster than loud ones. Why? Because loud people are honest about their damage, Julia said. Quiet people inventory yours before they spend theirs. Edward let the line settle, not because it was elegant, but because it sounded learned. And Elias inventories damage. Yes. How well do you know him? Julia's gaze held his. Well enough to know when he stops being passive and starts becoming selective. Ashcroft looked up. That happened last night. Yes. When? At the point Vivian mentioned publication ending someone's life. Edward nodded slowly. And you believed she meant Elias. No, Julia said. I believed Elias believed she meant him. Better, much better. Edward leaned forward a fraction. That's a useful distinction. It's the only one that matters. Does it? Yes, Julia looked at the untouched water glasses between them. Because if Vivian meant someone else, then only the person who mistook themselves for the target had reason to move first. Ashcroft wrote that down. Edward did not. He was already somewhere else in the room. How long had Vivian known whatever she intended to reveal? Julia hesitated again. It depends on what you think she intended to reveal. Edward kept his voice flat. I'm asking what you think. Julia looked annoyed now, not by the question, by the necessity of answering it honestly in front of someone who might use the answer better than she had. I think she knew enough to frighten more than one person, Julia said, but I do not think she knew everything. Why not? Because if she had known everything, she would have been less pleased with herself. That was almost funny. More importantly, it was probably true. People like Vivian Voss enjoyed partial superiority more than full understanding, because partial superiority allowed performance. Full understanding usually required consequences, and consequences ended dinner parties too early. Edward shifted. Tell me about Elias. Be more specific. You were aligned once. Julia's face remained calm, but the calm itself changed temperature. Clara said that. She suggested it. Julia nodded once.
Then she chose the efficient word. How aligned? We worked differently than the others. In what way? We understood that Vivian's genius was partly administrative. Edward said nothing. Julia continued. That surprises people. They think talent arrives in a romantic storm and assistants exist to catch pages. Vivian's real gift was extraction. She built systems around attention, around dependency, around sequence. Elias understood that. So did I. You and he spoke about it? Yes. Privately? Of course. How long ago? Years. Still recently? No. The last answer was too smooth. Edward noticed Ashcroft notice it too. He let a beat pass. Why did you stop speaking? Julia gave him the first genuinely unreadable look of the morning. Because working under someone like Vivian teaches you to confuse alliance with resemblance. Elias and I were not alike in any way that survives pressure. That sounds recent. It sounds accurate. Edward changed direction again. Did you see the extra sheet under the manuscript? Yes. Before Vivian fell? Yes. What did you think it was? A note? What kind of note? A reveal. Julia's mouth tightened. Perhaps a name,
Perhaps a line she meant to read. Perhaps a page from the manuscript she wanted to weaponize separately. Did you read any of it? No. You're sure? Yes. Were you curious? Julia almost laughed. Curiosity was the operating atmosphere of the room. And yet you did not lean forward? No. Why? Because Vivian would have enjoyed it. That too felt true. When did you notice it was gone? Julia did not answer immediately. Edward waited. Before Elias moved, she said. That changed the room. Ashcroft looked up sharply. Edward remained very still. Explain. Julia clasped her hands loosely in her lap. The power flickered. Everyone looked up, or away, or inward. I looked at Vivian's right hand because I thought she was about to lift the top page, but instead, Julia stopped. Instead, she shifted her hand, not much, enough that I saw the lower edge of the stack clearly. The extra sheet was gone before she collapsed. Edward said nothing for a full 2 seconds. Gone because she removed it, Ashcroft said. Possibly, Julia replied. Or because someone else removed it before the flicker, Edward said. Julia nodded once. Yes. Did you see anyone remove it? No. Did you see Vivian touch it separately from the manuscript? No. Then why are you certain it was gone before Elias moved? Julia's answer came flat and exact. Because when she fell, the stack slid slightly. If the sheet had still been beneath it, the top pages would have skewed differently. Edward almost smiled. There it was, the archivist. Not emotional inference, weight behavior. Ashcroft asked, You saw that in the moment? No, Julia said. I understood it afterward. Edward believed her. More than Clara, perhaps. Julia's memory was spatial, not moral. Different people lied differently, but spatial thinkers usually lied with omission, not structure. So, if the sheet was gone before the collapse, Edward said quietly, then Elias did not remove it in the second Clara believes he reached for the manuscript. Julia met his gaze. Correct.
Then why step toward it? Because he thought something had changed. What? I don't know. You have a theory? Yes. Give it to me. She looked tired now for the first time. I think Vivian expected to reveal something on that page, Julia said. And when the moment came, it was no longer there. She realized it too late. The line landed hard and clean. Ashcroft closed her notebook part way, then opened it again. Edward kept his tone almost casual. You think the death followed the missing page? No. Julia shook her head. I think the room did. He nodded. Excellent answer, which meant it was probably dangerous. Could Vivian have removed the page herself before speaking? Yes. Would she? Julia thought. Only if she wanted to appear more in control than she was. That seems likely. It always seemed likely with Vivian. Edward turned the idea over and found that it did not yet fit. Not because Vivian was incapable of hiding her own blade, she was, but because the announcement at dinner had felt like escalation, and escalation usually required visible leverage. Removing the page before the speech weakened the room, unless the page had already done its work elsewhere. Did you tell Elias about the archive before dinner? No. Did he know, in your opinion? I can't say. You can. Julia's eyes cooled. I think he suspected Vivian was preparing a transfer of power, she said. Whether he knew it was me specifically, I don't know. Would that have mattered to him? Yes. Why? Because Elias values access more than authorship. Edward filed that carefully. Meaning? Meaning Daniel wants interpretation. Mira wants moral victory. Clara wants the record not to lie. Owen wants damage contained. Elias, she paused, Elias wants proximity to the document before anyone else decides what it means. That was one of the best descriptions yet. Ashcroft asked, And you? Julia looked at her.
I want the document to survive its admirers." Then, before either of them could follow, she added, "Which is another way of saying, yes, Inspector, I had motive. You need not circle the word in your notes." Ashcroft did not smile. Edward almost did. He changed course again suddenly. "When Vivian omitted you verbally at dinner, why didn't you respond?" Julia did not blink. "Because that was the response." "Explain." She was signaling two things at once. To the room, omission looked ominous. To me, it looked private, which meant either she had moved my role elsewhere, into the archive, or she wanted the others to wonder why I had been spared. And which did you believe? Both. Did that frighten you? No. Why not? Because being publicly ignored by Vivian was usually safer than being publicly understood. He nodded. That line explained more of Julia's history than she intended. "And yet you watched Elias." "Yes. Not Vivian. Not first. Because? Because Elias had already understood that omission differently." Edward let the silence extend. "Did he look angry?" "No." "Afraid?" "No." "What then?" Julia answered with precision. "Corrected." That word changed everything, and he knew it the moment she said it. "Corrected," he repeated. "Yes." As though he had received new information. "Yes." "From Vivian?" "No." "From the missing page?" Julia held his gaze. "Possibly." He stood. For the first time, Julia looked up at him rather than across at him. Not submission, recalibration. "You already know what matters, don't you?" she said. Edward glanced toward the door. "I know the death may not have been the first successful action at the table." Ashcroft rose as well. "What was?" Edward looked at both women. "The removal of the page," he said. "If Julia is correct, it vanished before Vivian collapsed. That means the first victory of the evening was not murder. It was editorial." He moved toward the door, then stopped.
One last question, Miss Vale. If Vivian had placed a page beneath the manuscript intending to reveal it dramatically, what would she most likely have put there? Julia did not need time for this one. A dedication, a name, or a copy of a letter? Which? Julia's expression hardened into something almost like old anger. "If she truly meant to end someone's life," she said, "then not a name." She paused. "A line in their own words." Edward nodded once. When they were alone in the hall, Ashcroft said, "Well?" Edward did not answer immediately. He walked 3 steps toward the dining room and stopped where the corridor gave him a partial view of the table through the open doors. Morning had shifted into near-noon light now. The room looked flatter, more procedural. "Good." "Julia gave us the first honest structural contradiction," he said. Ashcroft waited. "Clara places the missing sheet's disappearance after the collapse because that preserves the idea that Elias moved toward the manuscript as an opportunist in panic. Julia places the disappearance before the collapse because she reconstructs by weight and edge alignment rather than by blame." "And you believe Julia?" "Yes." "Completely?" "No, but on this point, yes." Ashcroft considered. "Which means Elias may be guilty of something else, but not of removing the missing page after Vivian fell." "Correct." "And if the page vanished before the collapse?" Edward looked toward the evidence table in the dining room, where the bagged manuscript lay with all the innocence paper liked to perform after being read too late. "Then Vivian either removed her own blade before using it," he paused, "or someone in that room disarmed her before she could speak." Ashcroft folded her arms. "And the death?" Edward smiled faintly. "In rooms run by writers, Inspector, the most dangerous act is often revision. Murder usually follows once someone realizes the text no longer protects them." He started walking again. "Who next?" she asked. "Elias," Edward said. "Because Julia all but handed him to us?" "No." He glanced back once. "Because she didn't." Chapter 4. Elias Rowe. Elias Rowe looked like a man who had spent years learning how not to leave a mark. Edward noticed it before they shook hands.
Inspector Ashcroft arranged the interview in Vivian Voss's library, which was either an act of subtle cruelty or practical exhaustion, perhaps both. The room was long, dark-paneled, and built for people who enjoyed the feeling of being watched by dead language. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, crowded with first editions, heavily annotated proofs, foreign translations, and the expensive vanity of a person who had never confused writing with privacy. The windows here were narrower than in the dining room. The morning light entered in measured strips, broken by mullions, making the room feel more judicial than literary. Elias was already inside when Edward entered. He stood near one of the lower shelves, not reading the spines, not touching anything, simply existing in the space with the self-control of someone who understood that nervous movement was a form of confession. He was dressed more plainly than the others had been, though not cheaply. Gray shirt, dark jacket, no tie, the careful neutrality of a man who had built his adult life around making himself useful in rooms where louder people received both credit and blame. He turned as they entered. "Mr. Hale." "Mr. Rowe." Elias nodded to Ashcroft, but did not greet her verbally. Interesting. He had already decided where the greater threat sat. "Please," Edward said, gesturing toward the 2 chairs placed near the fireplace. Elias sat, but not before moving the chair half an inch backward to widen the space between himself and the small side table. Not fear, geometry. Men who liked exits also liked angles. Ashcroft remained standing for the first minute, letting the room settle around them. Edward took the chair opposite Elias and did not open his notebook yet. That always made careful people slightly uneasy. They preferred to watch their danger being written down. "You were Vivian Voss's last full-time assistant." "Yes." "How long?" 18 months. "Why did you leave?" Elias gave the faintest suggestion of a smile. "That depends on the version. I prefer the expensive one." This time the smile lasted long enough to become real, though not warm. "I left because I realized proximity and loyalty are often confused by the person being served," he said, "and because she preferred the confusion."
Edward nodded. Good answer. Not defensive, not theatrical, and nearly useless unless pressed properly. And the cheap version? Elias looked toward the shelves briefly. She stopped being survivable. Edward filed that away. Did you hate her? No. The answer came too quickly to be polished. That was fast. It was accurate. Hate is tiring, Elias said. Vivian was more foundational than that. Edward tilted his head slightly. Foundational. She altered the architecture of other people's lives and called it mentorship. That sounded like Vivian. It also sounded like a man who had spent years refining his resentment until it looked fit for publication. Edward let the silence do a little work before changing direction. You believed she was speaking to you at dinner? Elias did not flinch. Yes. Why? Because she was. That's certainty, not evidence. Elias folded his hands loosely. She had been using broad language all evening. Then she stopped. Meaning? Meaning the accusations became directional. He looked directly at Edward now. Writers do this. They throw ambiguity to the room so that one person can feel singled out without anyone else being sure why. Edward nodded once. Clara had said almost the same thing, though with less ownership and more caution. And you felt singled out? Yes. Because of what? Elias did not answer immediately. Ashcroft finally sat down. The sound of the chair leg on the floor was small, but it altered the room enough to break the pause. "Mr. Rowe," she said, "this is where you help yourself." He turned slightly toward her, then back to Edward. Vivian had a talent for retaining damaging information until the moment it became most useful, he said. Last night I believed she intended to use some of it. About you? Yes. What information? Elias's gaze drifted toward the fireless grate.
I'm not sure. That was the first clear lie. Edward did not challenge it directly. Better to step around it and let it see its own outline. You were close to Julia Vale once. Elias's expression did not change enough for ordinary people to notice. Edward noticed. We worked together, he said. That wasn't the question. No, Elias agreed, but it may be the relevant answer. Was it? Yes. How? We recognized the same things in Vivian. Edward nodded slowly. Administration disguised as genius. This time Elias looked genuinely surprised. Julia said that. She's perceptive. She's selective, Elias corrected. Edward leaned back. Meaning? Meaning Julia sees structure beautifully when structure protects her. That was not affection, nor was it simple contempt. Good. How close were you? Elias took a breath, held it for half a second, and let it go. Professionally close, he said, intellectually aligned for a time, not romantically involved if that's what you're circling. I wasn't. Good, it would be the least interesting version. Ashcroft's pen moved. Edward did not look at her. When did you stop being aligned? When we realized we wanted different futures from the same damage. Edward let that sit. The sentence was likely rehearsed years ago and then never used until now. Explain. Elias looked almost annoyed that he had said something quotable. Julia wanted preservation, he said. Archive, record, context. She wanted to build safe distances around material so that no one could weaponize it carelessly. And you? I wanted access before curation. Edward smiled faintly. That's a very careful confession. It isn't a confession. No, Edward said, not legally. Elias looked at him in a way that suggested he understood exactly what kind of interviewer he was dealing with now and did not particularly enjoy it. Edward changed direction again. The missing sheet beneath the manuscript. Elias did not move. What about it? I saw it. What did you think it was? A trap. Edward almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was more useful than most answers. What kind of trap? The kind Vivian liked best. A document placed where everyone could know it mattered, but only one person would believe they understood why.
Did you understand why? Elias's eyes held his. I thought I did. And now? Now I think she intended multiple people to misread it at once. That too sounded true. Edward folded his hands. When did you first see the sheet? Before dinner. It was already under the stack. Did you read any of it? No. Did you try? No. Why not? Elias gave the smallest shrug. Because Vivian would have expected that, and because reading an exposed page in her presence was exactly the kind of vulgarity she designed rooms to punish. Yes, Edward thought, that fitted the dead woman perfectly. When did you notice it was gone? Elias answered at once, before she fell. That made 3 now. Julia certain, Clara uncertain but leaning late, and Elias immediate. How do you know? Because I was watching her hand. Why? He looked momentarily irritated. Because she was about to use the page. Use it how? Read from it, display it, name someone with it. I don't know the exact form. He paused. But she had shifted the manuscript several times during the previous 10 minutes. She was building toward a reveal. Then, just before the lights flickered, her hand moved and the pressure on the stack changed. Edward went very still. Pressure. Elias nodded. The pages settled differently. Describe that. The stack flattened, minutely, but enough. Ashcroft looked up. You saw that in the moment? No. Elias gave the same answer Julia had, almost word for word, though with less precision and more irritation. I understood it afterward. Then what happened in the moment?
Elias looked toward the dining room, though the room itself was not visible from here. "In the moment," he said, "I saw Vivian realize something was wrong. That changed the room." Edward did not speak for 2 full beats. "What exactly did you see?" Elias's jaw tightened slightly. "Not fear, not immediately. Annoyance first, then recalculation." He paused. "Then the flicker. Then she tried to continue." "Continue what?" "The reveal." "But the page was gone." "Yes." "Then why continue?" A strange expression crossed Elias's face then, not admiration, not contempt, something uglier and older. "Because Vivian believed performance could overcome incomplete information," he said. "It had for most of her life." Edward believed that instantly. "Did she know who took the page?" "I don't know." "You have an opinion?" "Yes." "Give it to me." Elias leaned back in his chair. "I think she suspected more than one person," he said. "That was the genius of the room. She had designed it so guilt would distribute itself before anything concrete happened." Edward shook his head slightly. "That's not your opinion. That's your essay." For the first time, Elias let the irritation show. "My opinion," he said, "is that she looked at Julia when she realized the page was missing." Ashcroft's pen stopped. Edward watched Elias carefully. "You are sure?" "No," Elias said, "but I'm more sure of that than I am of most of what followed." "Interesting. Very interesting." "Why would she look at Julia?" "Because Julia was the one person at that table Vivian considered capable of removing a page without ruining the stack." Edward almost smiled again, not because it exonerated anyone, but because it was such a perfectly literary accusation, theft by competence. "And yet Julia says she was watching you." "Of course she does." "Why of course?" "Because I moved." There it was. "You stepped toward the manuscript." "Yes." "Why?" Elias did not answer immediately. "Because the room changed." "That's mood, not action." "No," Elias said quietly. "It's timing." Edward waited. Elias continued. "Vivian realized the page was gone. Julia saw it too. I'm certain of that now. Clara saw movement but not sequence. Daniel was still interpreting. Owen was waiting for something practical to happen. Mira was enjoying the possibility of damage." He paused. "I stepped toward the manuscript because I believed the next 5 seconds would determine whether Vivian improvised publicly or named someone blindly." "And that mattered to you?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because blind naming from Vivian was worse than truth. It contaminated everything afterward." Edward nodded slowly. That was either sincere or one of the most elegantly defensive lies he had heard in months. "Did you touch the manuscript?" "No." "Did you touch the missing page?" "No." "Did you see anyone touch it?" "No." "Then why did you stop moving?" Elias looked at him. "Because she died." Edward did not move. "No," he said quietly, "that's the official order. I'm asking about the instant before everyone else understood she was dying." Elias's eyes narrowed very slightly. "You're assuming I saw something I haven't described. I'm assuming you're careful enough not to describe it unless I earn it." For the first time, Elias almost laughed. "That's a very Vivian sentence." "I know." Something passed between them then, distaste, perhaps, or professional recognition. In cases like this, both often wore the same coat. Elias exhaled slowly. She looked at me," he said. Edward said nothing. "And?" Ashcroft asked. "And for a moment," Elias continued, "I thought she was about to speak my name." The room stayed quiet. "But she didn't." "No." "What did she do instead?" Edward asked. Elias's voice flattened. "She reached for the wine." Edward looked at him carefully. That is not what Clara saw. Clara was on the other side. That is not what Daniel says either. Daniel is a man who watches for symbolism before sequence. And Julia? Elias turned his head toward the window. Julia watches the table, he said. I watched Vivian. That was good. Potentially true, also potentially designed. Did she drink? Elias looked back at him. Yes. How much? Very little. Enough? A beat. Yes. Now they were somewhere real. Edward leaned forward for the first time. Describe it exactly. Elias's expression hardened with the effort of precision. She had one hand near the manuscript. The glass was by her right elbow. After the flicker, almost immediately after, she touched the glass, lifted it, took a small amount, and set it down badly, not placed, returned badly. He paused. Then the hand jerked. Edward sat back again. Ashcroft said, "That's the first time anyone has described the sip happening after the flicker." Elias looked annoyed, but not surprised. Because everyone else is organizing memory around the collapse. The sip matters only if you think the death entered from the table, not the room. Silence. Edward let the sentence settle heavily. You believe it did? Yes. Why? Because Vivian changed direction. Elias looked almost tired now. If she had been dying naturally, she would have stayed inside the performance as long as she could. Instead, she abandoned the manuscript and went to the glass. Edward nodded once. There it was. Not proof, better, behavior. Did she seem frightened? No. Surprised? Yes. By the missing page?
Yes. By the taste? A much smaller pause. Yes. Edward watched him carefully. Was there anything in the wine before the flicker? I don't know. Did anyone pour for her? The bottle was already on the table. She poured for herself earlier. Could someone beside her have touched the glass without being seen? Elias looked at him. You know the seating diagram. That isn't an answer. Elias's voice stayed level. Yes, Clara could have. I could have. Possibly Daniel if he leaned during conversation, but not elegantly. Elegance matters? In that room, yes. Edward believed that. The killer, if one sat at the table, would almost certainly have chosen a method that looked like it belonged to Vivian's house. He changed direction again quickly. Did you know about Julia and the archive before dinner? Elias did not answer at once. Yes, he said. Ashcroft looked up sharply. Who told you? Vivian. When? 3 days ago. Edward's eyes narrowed. Privately? Yes. Why? Elias's mouth moved in something close to disgust. Because she wanted to know whether I would pretend to be pleased for Julia. And did you? No. What did you say? That paper belongs with the person least tempted to worship it. And? She said that was the nicest thing anyone had ever said about Julia in that house. Edward let the silence run. So you knew before dinner, and Julia didn't know that you knew? No. Would that have changed how she watched you? Yes. How? She would have mistaken my reaction for ambition, when it was mostly... He stopped. Mostly what? Recognition. Edward said nothing. Recognition of what? That Vivian was setting us against one another using succession. He looked down briefly at his own hands. Again. That felt true enough to keep. Edward stood at last. Elias looked up. You think I poisoned her? I think you noticed the page disappear before most of the room understood the manuscript had changed. That's not the same thing. No, I agreed, it isn't. Ashcroft closed her notebook. One final question, she said. Why did you move toward the manuscript instead of toward Vivian? Elias answered without hesitation. Because in that room, the manuscript was the weapon before the body knew it was dead. When they were alone in the hall, Ashcroft let the library door close fully before speaking. Well, Edward did not answer immediately.
He walked halfway toward the dining room, then stopped exactly where he had earlier, the table visible through the open doors at a distance that made it look flatter and more abstract than it had in person. Good. Distance reduced personality and improved structure. He changed direction again quickly. "Did you know about Julia and the archive before dinner?" Elias did not answer at once. "Yes," he said. Ashcroft looked up sharply. "Who told you?" "Vivian." "When?" "3 days ago." Edward's eyes narrowed. "Privately?" "Yes." "Why?" Elias's mouth moved in something close to disgust. "Because she wanted to know whether I would pretend to be pleased for Julia." "And did you?" "No." "What did you say?" "That paper belongs with the person least tempted to worship it." "And?" "She said that was the nicest thing anyone had ever said about Julia in that house." Edward let the silence run. "So you knew before dinner, and Julia didn't know that you knew?" "No." "Did what you say change how she watched you?" "Yes." "How?" "She would have mistaken my reaction for ambition, when it was mostly—" He stopped. "Mostly what?" "Recognition." Edward said nothing. "Recognition of what?" "That Vivian was setting us against one another using succession." He looked down briefly at his own hands. Again, that felt true enough to keep. Edward stood at last. Elias looked up. "You think I poisoned her. I think you noticed the page disappear before most of the room understood the manuscript had changed. That's not the same thing." "No," I agreed, "it isn't." Ashcroft closed her notebook. "One final question," she said. "Why did you move toward the manuscript instead of toward Vivian?" Elias answered without hesitation. "Because in that room, the manuscript was the weapon before the body knew it was dead. When they were alone in the hall, Ashcroft let the library door close fully before speaking." "Well?" Edward did not answer immediately. He walked halfway toward the dining room, then stopped exactly where he had earlier, the table visible through the open doors at a distance that made it look flatter and more abstract than it had in person. Good. Distance reduced personality and improved structure. "He gave us the sip," Ashcroft said. "Yes." "After the flicker?" "Yes." "You believe him?" "On that point, yes." Ashcroft folded her arms. "Which means Vivian realized the page was gone, tried to continue, reached for wine, tasted or consumed something, and then collapsed." Edward nodded. "Possibly." "That sounds like murder." "It sounds like sequence," he corrected. She looked at him sidelong. "And the rest?" Edward's gaze moved from Vivian's chair to Clara's, then to Julia's place by the windows. "The rest is motive rearranging itself under pressure. You don't think Elias removed the page?" "No." "You don't think Julia did either?" He glanced at her. "Did I say that?" "No, but you don't sound convinced." Edward smiled faintly. "Conviction is what happens when all the useful lies begin pointing in the same direction. We're not there yet." Ashcroft considered. "What matters most?"
"3 things," Edward said. "First, the page vanished before the collapse. Second, Vivian knew it had vanished. Third, she still drank after knowing it had vanished." Ashcroft was silent for a second. "Why would she do that?" Edward looked toward the table. "Because she thought the greater danger had shifted." "To whom?" He glanced back at the closed library door. "That," he said, "depends on what was on the missing page." "And who next?" Edward answered immediately. "Owen Hart." Ashcroft raised an eyebrow. "Not Daniel?" "Daniel interprets too noisily. Mira resents too theatrically. Owen handles practical transitions. If something at that table changed before the death in a way no one else registered, he's the one most likely to have seen it and filed it as logistics rather than emotion." He began walking again. "And after Owen?" "Then Daniel," Edward said, "because men who live by interpretation often give away more than they mean once they realize the room no longer respects their version."
He stopped outside the dining room and looked in once more. The table waited, 7 places reduced now to angle, reach, and memory. Somewhere in the space between the missing page and the poisoned sip, Vivian Voss had understood she no longer controlled the final chapter. The only question remaining was whether the person who stole that control had planned to kill her, or merely edited the room until death became the cleanest available ending. Chapter 5. Owen Hart. Owen Hart entered the room like a man who had spent most of his life arriving after something had already gone wrong. Edward Hale had been expecting that. Some people answered questions with memory. Others answered with grievance or fear or the instinctive desire to shape how they would later be described. Owen answered with sequence. That made him more useful than the others and, in certain ways, more dangerous. Men who managed crises for a living often trained themselves to notice the practical fact before the emotional meaning. They were the ones who saw the glass tip before the scream, the hand move before the accusation, the door remain open half a second too long after everyone else had already turned their heads toward the body. The interview took place not in the library this time, nor in any of the soft, curated rooms Vivian Voss had designed to flatter intelligence into cruelty, but in the breakfast room just off the kitchen. Ashcroft's choice, not Edward's. He approved of it immediately. The room was less beautiful than the rest of the house, and therefore less compromised by its owner. Pale stone floor, round table, too much light, a smell of coffee and stainless steel drifting in from the kitchen corridor. It was the first room in the house in which no one was likely to perform, because no one worth impressing had ever been meant to sit there. Owen appreciated that too. Edward could tell by the way he exhaled once when he entered, as if relieved not to be interrogated beneath the stare of shelves or the accusation of the dead woman's furniture. He was broader than the others, older than Daniel, younger than Vivian had liked to acknowledge, and tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. His hair had gone silver in the useful places, at the temples and above the ears, giving him the permanent look of a man everyone trusted to handle insurance forms after funerals. He did not sit until asked, and when he did, he took the chair with the wall behind him and the door in view. Practical men always did. Mr. Hart. Hale. No Mr. No performance. Good. You handled Vivian's schedules, appearances, contracts. And the fallout after all 3, Owen said. How long?
2 years, 7 months. Why did you leave? Owen looked at the carafe of water on the table, then not at it. Because after a while you realize some people don't need managing, he said. They need containing, and I wasn't interested in making that my last professional skill. Edward nodded. Did you hate her? Owen thought for a second. No. That answer came slower than Elias's, faster than Daniel's would have, and with more honesty than Clara had allowed herself. Why not? Because hate implies surprise. Vivian was always exactly what she was. Ashcroft, standing near the counter with her notebook open, said, That sounds almost forgiving. Owen glanced at her. It isn't. It's bookkeeping. Edward almost smiled. He began where he needed to. You were the first person physically around the table after she fell. Yes. You came around from the end. Yes. You didn't hesitate. No. Why? Owen gave him a look that contained in compressed form several years of experience cleaning up after celebrated adults. Because everyone else did. Edward let that settle. Walk me through the final 30 seconds, he said. Not your interpretation, your sequence. Owen nodded once. Good, Edward thought. Exactly the right word. Vivian was speaking, not reading. She had one hand on the manuscript and the other near the wine.
The storm was loud enough by then that everyone in the room had started leaning slightly toward the center without realizing it. Then the lights flickered. "Where did you look?" "Up first, then at the windows." "Not at Vivian?" "Not immediately." "Why the windows?" "Because this house has backup power and expensive systems fail in ways that become expensive if you ignore them." I paused. "That's not literary, but it's true." Edward nodded. "And then?" I looked back at the table. "What did you see first?" "Vivian's hand moving." "Which hand?" "Right." "Doing what?" Owen frowned slightly, not with uncertainty, but with the irritation of a man trying to force exactness onto memory. "Not reaching," he said, "correcting." That word landed well. "Correcting what?" "The manuscript, I thought, but then she went to the glass." Ashcroft looked up. "You saw the sip?" "Yes." "After the flicker?" "Yes." "How much?" "Not much. Barely enough to count unless you were already watching her hand." Edward leaned back slightly. "And were you?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because something about her changed before she moved." "Changed how?" He took longer with that answer. "Her timing broke," he said at last. Edward said nothing. Owen continued. "Vivian controlled silence aggressively. You'll have noticed that from everyone's statements. She liked pauses because other people rushed to fill them and gave themselves away. But right after the flicker, there was a fraction of a second where she paused not like a writer, but like a person who had just discovered something missing." Ashcroft's pen stopped. Edward did not move.
"You're sure?" Owen looked at him directly. "Yes." "Missing what?" "The page under the manuscript." There it was again, now 4 people converging from different angles. "How did you know there was a page?" "Because I noticed it before dinner." "Why?" Owen shrugged. "That's the kind of thing I used to be paid to notice. Vivian liked props that looked accidental. A sheet under the manuscript that changes the height by 3 millimeters is not accidental." "Did you know what was on it?" "No." "Did you suspect?" "Yes." "What?" "That it was something she intended to produce at exactly the wrong moment for the person it concerned." Edward nodded. That was everyone's assumption in one form or another. "Good." Rooms like this became clearer when the same fear appeared in different sentences. "When did you realize it was gone?" "After the flicker, before the collapse." "Not after?" "No." "Why are you certain?" Owen leaned forward slightly, forearms on knees, and Edward saw the earlier profession in him more clearly now. Not literary, operational. "Because the stack settled, and because Vivian noticed it before anyone else noticed her noticing it." That was the best description yet. "Explain." Owen did. "She had one hand partly on the pages," he said, "not enough to pin the whole stack, enough to feel its shape. When the lights flickered, she looked down, not at the room, not at the windows, not at any of us, down. And the expression was not fear, it was irritation. The kind people get when someone has moved an object in their house by 2 inches and expects them not to care. Then she reached for the wine." Edward was silent for a beat. "So the sip was after the realization." "Yes." "And then?" "The hand jerked. The glass tipped. She lost the chair." "Did she say anything?" "No." "No intake of breath? No name?" Owen shook his head. "Nothing verbal." Edward let the room go quiet. That mattered. People poisoned by surprise often lost words not because of physiology, but because cognition rerouted itself around disbelief. Vivian, if she tasted something wrong, might not have named it because naming would have required admitting the room had outwritten her. He changed direction. Who at the table understood first that the page was gone? Owen's answer came too fast to be considered, which made it more useful. Elias. "Why?" "Because he moved." "That's observable. I'm asking for reasoning." Owen's mouth tightened briefly.
Because he wasn't moving toward Vivian, he was moving toward the consequence. Edward looked at him. That's a very specific distinction. It's the right one. Who understood second? Owen hesitated. Julia. Why? Because she was already looking across the table before anyone else knew where to look. Edward nodded slowly, consistent again. Did she move? No. Why not? Owen thought. Because Julia only moves when she knows what ownership will look like afterward. Ashcraft looked up sharply at that one. Edward didn't. You think in terms of ownership. In houses like this, you have to, especially once the owner is on the floor. There it was, clean and unpleasant and completely real. The mood everyone wanted to decorate as shock had become what it always becomes in estates with money, rights, or paper, succession. Edward pressed. When did you know about Julia and the archive? Last night. Only last night? Yes. Who told you? Vivian. How? Casually, Owen said, with the kind of disgust only seasoned professionals could bring to the word, which from Vivian meant strategically. Exactly what did she say? Owen looked at the light on the table. I've left the papers to the only one among you who understands that legacy is a technical problem before it is a moral one. Edward almost smiled. It was the kind of sentence Vivian would have admired in print and enjoyed more in a room. And who did you think she meant before she named Julia? Could have been Clara, could have been Julia. Certainly not Daniel, not Mira, not me. Why not you? Owen shrugged once. Because I know the difference between estate management and literary intimacy, and Vivian liked to confuse them. Good. Did Elias know before dinner? I don't know.
That's not useful. It's accurate. Owen looked at him steadily. But I'll give you the next best thing. He behaved like someone who had been privately warned that the evening would contain a transfer of power. Edward did not move. Warned by whom? Vivian, most likely, or by inference. Elias was good at inference when proximity mattered. Did Julia know he knew? Owen shook his head. If she did, she hid it. Edward filed that. What did you make of Elias stepping toward the manuscript? Owen's answer came slower than the others would have. I thought he was either going to secure it or verify the loss. Which? I still don't know. Which seems more likely? Verify, Owen said. If he wanted to secure the whole stack, he'd have committed harder. The movement was too brief. That aligned with what Edward had begun to suspect. He changed course again. Daniel says the glass moved first. Owen snorted softly. Daniel says whatever preserves drama. That sounds unkind. It sounds accurate. Mira says she looked away. Mira was already half in performance the entire evening. Clara? Clara sees a lot and edits what she reports according to whether elegance can survive contact with fact. Edward said nothing. And Julia? Owen looked at him for a long second. Julia sees structure, he said, which means she is often right and almost never complete. Because? Because complete truths are difficult to preserve. Ashcroft wrote that down. Edward shifted again, quickly enough to catch him off balance. Who could have touched Vivian's glass? Owen answered immediately. Clara, Elias, possibly Vivian herself in some staged way before the speech. Daniel if he leaned too far. No one else cleanly. What about before dinner? Owen took a moment. Staff, housekeeper while setting, anyone with unsupervised access to the table after staging. Did that happen? Yes. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. Tell me. After the table was set, Vivian sent the housekeeper out twice, once about flowers, once because she changed her mind about the candles. There was also a point, brief, when she was alone in the room before guests were brought in. Ashcroft looked up. That's not in the staff summary. Owen nodded. Because no one asked me if I noticed the household sequence before the guests sat down. Edward smiled faintly. That was unwise of them. How long was she alone? Not long, maybe 2 minutes. Enough to rearrange a place setting, not enough to rewrite the evening. Edward stood and moved toward the window. He needed distance to think, and Owen looked like a man who trusted silence only when someone else was paying for it. So, Vivian alone with the table after it was staged, the extra page beneath the manuscript before guests arrived, the announcement of Julia's inheritance at dinner, the page vanishing before the collapse, the sip after realization, and now this. Vivian may have had a private opportunity to alter one glass, one page, one note, one arrangement before the witnesses entered. He turned back. Did Vivian intend to poison someone? Ashcroft did not react, but Owen did. Not outwardly exactly, but in the tiny sharpening of the shoulders that said the thought had already visited him and he disliked having it spoken aloud. "I don't know," Owen said. That wasn't the question. "Yes," he said quietly. "I considered it." Why? Because she was in a theatrical mood, because she had arranged the room too precisely, and because Vivian believed revelation should have physical consequences if possible. Do you think the intended victim was herself? No. Who then? Owen took longer now. Whoever the missing page named. There it was. Edward walked back to the table. And if the page vanished before she could reveal it, then either the target disarmed her or someone protecting the target did. Would that make the wine incidental? Owen looked at him. No. Why not? Because if Vivian had prepared something for someone else and drank it herself after the page vanished, he paused. That would be exactly the kind of ending she would have called intolerably vulgar. Edward almost laughed, not because death was amusing, because the dead woman's standards became an investigative principle, and in this house that made perfect sense. Do you think she knew the wine was wrong when she drank? Owen thought. Yes.
Then why drink? Because she had already lost the page. Edward said nothing. Owen continued, quieter now. And for Vivian, public loss of control was worse than risk. If the page was gone, the room no longer belonged to her. She may have reached for the glass as if to buy half a second to improvise, or because she believed the danger had changed shape and wanted to test whether it had entered the table. Ashcroft finally spoke. She drank to confirm. Owen looked at her. Yes. The room stayed still after that. It was one of those answers that did not prove a thing chemically and yet made the dead person more comprehensible than any toxicology report would. Edward let the silence do a little more work, then asked the question he had been saving. Did you remove the page? No. Did you see who did? No. Did you believe in that second after the flicker that you knew who had? Owen met his gaze evenly. Yes. Who? Julia. Ashcroft did not look up. Edward did. Why? Because she was the only person at that table who would understand both the value of removing the page and the necessity of not touching the manuscript afterward. That was very nearly persuasive, which made it dangerous. And yet you also say Elias understood first. Yes. Then why not Elias? Because Elias reacts to access. Julia reacts to consequences. He filed it not as truth, but as taxonomy. He rose. That will do for now, Mr. Hart. Owen stood as well, relieved but not enough to be obvious about it. At the door he stopped. One thing, he said. Edward turned. The lights didn't just flicker, Owen said. The backup relays clicked half a second later. Everyone remembers the visual interruption. Hardly anyone remembers the sound. Edward looked at him carefully. And? Owen's expression was flat. If someone at the table had trained themselves to move on auditory cues instead of visual ones, the room gave them cover twice. That was useful enough to survive the morning on its own. When Owen had gone, Ashcroft closed the door. Well, she said. Edward stood in the center of the breakfast room and let the scene reassemble itself one more time. Now it collapses, he said. Into what? Into succession. Ashcroft leaned against the counter. "Explain." He did.
Vivian stages the room, places the hidden sheet beneath the manuscript, either to reveal a quotation, a letter, or something in someone else's words that would publicly destroy them. She also announces Julia's control over the archive, changing the inheritance landscape in real time. That matters more than the room initially understands. The missing page vanishes before the collapse. Vivian realizes it. She drinks after realizing it. Elias steps toward the manuscript, not to steal it, but to verify what has changed. Julia watches Elias because she already understands his understanding. Owen sees the practical sequence. Clara sees the emotional geometry. Ashcroft nodded slowly. "And Daniel?" Edward smiled faintly. "Daniel will give us motive disguised as interpretation." She looked at him. "You think Julia took the page?" "I think Owen wants her to have taken it. That is not the same thing." "You think Vivian poisoned someone else?" "I think it's possible." "And instead drank the wrong glass?" "Possible," Edward repeated, "but only if the room was arranged to allow substitution without vulgarity." Ashcroft crossed her arms. "And was it?" Edward looked at the untouched water glasses on the breakfast table, then toward the corridor leading back to the dining room. "That," he said, "depends on Daniel." "Because he's vain?" "Because vain men always believe they are only observing the table, when in fact they are also participating in its choreography." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Have toxicology expedite both the wine residue and the water, and pull the power logs from the house system with audio timing, not just visual interruption. Owen may be right. If the relay click follows the flicker, someone could have moved in the room's second blind spot." Ashcroft nodded. "And Daniel?" Edward looked back once. "Yes, Daniel now." He started walking. Behind them, the breakfast room returned to usefulness. Ahead, the house waited with all the patience of a dead author, certain the living would continue editing one another until only the strongest version remained. Edward intended to interrupt that process.
Epilogue: The Reconstruction. Edward Hale gathered them in the dining room just after 4 in the afternoon. The storm was gone. That changed the house more than grief had. In daylight, the windows no longer reflected the room back on itself. The city beyond them was visible again, distant and indifferent, and the long dining table had lost the Gothic authority it had carried the night before. It was just a table now, a very expensive one, polished wood, 7 chairs, 1 absent host. That helped. Rooms designed for performance became easier to understand once the audience had dispersed and the weather stopped cooperating. Inspector Ashcroft stood near the doorway with her notebook closed. She had already decided this meeting was no longer about collecting statements. It was about watching who chose to interrupt first. Daniel Mercer sat rigidly, one ankle over one knee, performing a version of composure that had begun cracking an hour earlier and was now mostly habit. Mira Sahlberg stood instead of sitting, arms folded, as if refusing the chair protected her from the room's logic. Clara Weiss had taken the same seat she had occupied during dinner, whether deliberately or not. Owen Hart sat with both hands on his knees, posture practical, as though meetings like this ended either in signatures or handcuffs, and he preferred to be ready for either. Elias Rowe remained very still beside Vivian's old place, too still, perhaps, but no longer unreadable. And Julia Vale stood by the windows, not hiding, not withdrawing, simply refusing to let the table decide her angle for her a second time. The manuscript, bagged and sleeved, lay on the sideboard. The title page was still face down. Edward remained standing. "No one leaves yet," Ashcroft said quietly, mostly for the room, though the police officers outside the hall made the point redundant. No one answered. Edward looked once around the table. Vivian Voss did not plan her own death, he said. That was the first lie this house offered, and all of you were intelligent enough to flirt with it because it was flattering. It made her look omnipotent. It made the rest of you look trapped inside a masterpiece. No one moved. She did, however, plan a revelation, Edward continued. She built this dinner to produce a final public rearrangement of power. That part was real. The manuscript was real. The hidden page under it was real. The threat was real. What was not real was her control of the ending. Mira spoke first. So this is the part where we all become characters in your neat little explanation. Edward looked at her. No, he said, this is the part where the furniture stops lying. That shut her up for the moment. He turned slightly, enough to keep all six in view. Vivian staged the room before any of you arrived. The hidden sheet under the manuscript was not decorative. It was intended to be revealed separately. Not a title page, not a menu, a weapon. Most likely a line in someone else's words, something specific enough to damage one person and implicate several others. Daniel leaned forward. And you know this how? Because Vivian Voss preferred citations to accusations. Accusations are vulgar, quotations survive. Clara lowered her eyes briefly. Elias didn't. Edward continued. She also made another move before dinner. She announced, or intended to announce, the succession of her archive to Julia Vale. That mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Not because of sentiment, because literary estates are power. Manuscripts, letters, drafts, marginalia, unfinished work, private correspondence. Control of the archive means control of memory. Vivian knew that. Julia knew that. Clara understood it. Elias understood it. Owen recognized it instantly, even if he preferred to call it administration. Owen said nothing. That was as close to confirmation as men like him usually gave in public. Last night, Vivian believed she was holding two blades at once. One was the hidden page, the other was succession. She intended to use both. He walked to her former place and rested his fingertips lightly on the chair back. Then the page disappeared. Julia did not move. Elias did. Only slightly, but enough. Edward nodded almost invisibly. Yes, he said, before Vivian collapsed, not after. That matters.
Daniel looked from one face to another, irritated now by how many people seemed to have known things he had only interpreted. So who took it? Edward ignored him. When the lights flickered, he said, everyone in the room looked somewhere, upward, outward, toward Vivian, toward the windows, toward their own danger. But there were two interruptions, not one. First, the visual flicker, then, half a second later, the relay click from the backup system. Owen noticed that, which means someone in the room had 2 moments of cover. Ashcroft said quietly, "We checked the power logs. He's right." Now several of them looked at Owen. He did not enjoy it. Edward continued. Vivian realized the page was gone before she fell. Multiple people saw that in different ways. Clara saw the change in her timing. Julia and Elias noticed the altered pressure and height of the stack. Owen recognized the shift in attention. That much of the room agrees on, despite all of your efforts to prefer different villains. Mira unfolded her arms. If everyone noticed, then why are we here? Because noticing is not the same thing as understanding. Edward crossed to the sideboard and lifted the bagged manuscript just high enough for all of them to look at it. This was not the only document on the table before dinner, he said, but it became the only one after the page was removed. That was the first true crime of the evening, not murder, revision. He turned to Julia.
You removed the page." Silence hit the room hard and clean. Daniel was the first to react, but only with a sharp inhalation. Mira turned fully toward Julia. Clara did not look surprised. Owen did not look pleased. Elias closed his eyes once and opened them again. Julia did not deny it. Instead, she said, "You took your time." Edward set the manuscript back down. "I wanted to know why." Mira stared at her. "You took it?" "Yes," Julia said. "Why the hell would you—" "Because Vivian was about to destroy the wrong person," Julia said, and for the first time all day her voice lost its measured archival discipline and showed the heat under it. Edward let the words settle. Daniel looked baffled. Good. His bafflement had become increasingly informative. "What was on the page?" Ashcroft asked. Julia looked at Edward, not the inspector. "A transcription," she said, "from a dictation session years ago. Vivian had kept everything, she always did. It was a paragraph in Elias's voice." Elias looked down, not in guilt exactly, but in the tired recognition of a wound reopening on schedule. Edward nodded. "Yes." He took over. Years ago, during his time as her assistant, Elias dictated material to Vivian that should never have survived in her files as leverage, not because it was criminal in itself, because it was private enough, desperate enough, and context-less enough to be devastating in print. Vivian intended to read from it or reveal it last night, implying that it proved something final about Elias. She had likely shaped the entire evening toward that moment. Daniel frowned. "So Elias was the target." Edward shook his head. "That is what Vivian wanted the room to think. It is not the same thing." He turned toward Julia. "You removed the page during the power interruption, not to protect yourself, to protect Elias." Julia did not answer. He answered for her. She knew where it was, she knew what it was, and unlike the others, she understood that once Vivian read from it, the room would never recover the original context. Vivian was too good at that. So Julia used the first interruption to slide the page free. Ashcroft said, "How?" Edward pointed to Vivian's place. The top edge of the hidden sheet was slightly offset beneath the manuscript. Julia had the right angle from the far side. During the flicker, Vivian's attention broke toward the stack. During the relay click, Julia moved, fast, precise, and only enough. No theatrical grab, just extraction. Clara spoke then, very quietly. "That's why the stack settled flatter before the collapse." "Yes," Edward said. Owen added, "And why Vivian looked at Julia." Edward nodded. She realized the page was gone, and she knew who at that table was technically capable of removing it without ruining the arrangement. Mira said, "So Julia stole the page. Fine. That explains the page. It doesn't explain why Vivian died." "No," Edward said. "That came next." He moved back toward the table. Vivian had prepared a second act. She had poisoned one of the glasses. That landed exactly as he expected. Daniel swore softly. Mira stared at the table as though it might reanimate. Clara's face did not change, but the stillness in her shoulders did. Owen looked at the wine marks in memory, not in shock. Elias remained silent. Julia shut her eyes once. Ashcroft spoke into the silence. Toxicology confirmed it an hour ago. Vivian's wine contained a fast-acting alkaloid. Concentrated, elegant, small dose, immediate collapse. No one spoke for a moment after that. Then Daniel said, "You're saying she planned to poison Elias?" Edward looked at him. "No." That surprised several of them more than the toxicology had. "She intended to poison Julia," Edward said. Now Julia moved, only a little, but enough. Mira stared at her. "Jesus!" Edward kept his voice flat. Vivian's mistake was simple. She built the trap too late, after she had already destabilized the room.
Once Julia removed the page, Vivian understood that the planned sequence had broken. She also understood something worse, that if she continued, she would be improvising in a room that had stopped belonging to her. Clara said quietly, "So she reached for the wine." "Yes." "Why?" "To buy time," Edward said, "to steady herself, to think, possibly to test whether the threat had entered the table. But the glass she reached for was the one she had prepared." Ashcroft added, "The dose was enough that even a small sip was fatal." Mira stared at Julia now, not with accusation, but with horrified comprehension. "You disarmed her," she said. Julia looked back at her. "I removed the page. You made her drink." "No," Julia said, and now her voice was cold again. "Vivian made Vivian drink. That was the first honest decision she made all evening." Daniel exhaled sharply. "So nobody killed her?" Edward looked at him. "No, somebody forced her to lose control. That is not the same thing." Daniel's frustration sharpened. "That's absurd. You drag us in here, talk about poison, missing pages, hidden succession, and now you're telling me this is what, manslaughter by editing?" Edward's eyes stayed on him. "No," he said. "I'm telling you that Vivian Voss engineered a murder and died in it." Silence. Then, before anyone else could speak, he turned to Elias. "And you knew what the page contained the moment you saw it was gone." Elias met his gaze. "Yes, because Vivian had shown you in advance." Another silence, thinner this time, but somehow more dangerous. Elias nodded once. "3 days ago," he said, "she summoned me, read part of it aloud, wanted to see if I'd panic." "And did you?" "No." Edward almost smiled. "But you knew she meant to use it at dinner." "Yes." "And you told Julia?" "No." That answer came fast enough to test. Edward said, "You didn't have to." Julia spoke before anyone stopped her. "He left me a message." Now all eyes turned to her. Elias did not. Julia continued, "Not a confession, not a warning in plain language. He sent me a scan of an old archival inventory number 2 hours before dinner, one I recognized from Vivian's private boxes. That number corresponded to the dictation reel." Edward nodded slowly. There it was, the last missing hinge. "So you knew to look for the page?" "Yes," Julia said. "Why didn't you say so before?" "Because then this becomes a story about collusion instead of sequence." Edward inclined his head. "Fair." Ashcroft said, "You removed evidence." Julia looked at her. "I removed blackmail disguised as literature." Ashcroft's expression did not soften. "That was not your decision to make." Julia's answer was immediate. "In this house, it already was." Edward intervened before the room hardened in the wrong direction. "Elias did not remove the page. Julia did. Elias predicted the reveal and signaled her. Vivian announced the archive to destabilize Julia publicly before using Elias's private words against him. Julia disarmed the reveal. Vivian realized it, reached for the poisoned wine, her poisoned wine, and died." Owen said quietly, "Then the real murder was the one that didn't happen." Edward looked at him. "Yes." "That's ugly." "Yes." Owen nodded once, as if that completed a private calculation. Mira let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "So all this because Vivian wanted one final scene?" Edward shook his head. "No, because she wanted ownership of the ending. The scene was just the delivery system." Daniel said, almost to himself, "And Julia inherits anyway." Julia looked at him. "That disturbs you more than the poison?" "It clarifies the room," Daniel replied. Edward stepped in before grievance could turn the ending sloppy. Julia inherits temporarily under the will. Whether she retains that role is an estate matter. Criminally, the essential facts are simpler. Vivian staged coercion. Elias anticipated the attack and warned Julia indirectly. Julia removed the page. Vivian, having lost control of the reveal, drank from the glass she had prepared. No one at this table administered the fatal sip. Ashcroft added, "The removed page is still missing." Julia said, "No." Every head turned again. She reached into the legal folder on the windowsill, opened it, and placed a sealed evidence sleeve on the table. Inside it was a single sheet, typed transcription, a paragraph, nothing outwardly dramatic, which was exactly why it was dangerous. "I took it," Julia said. "I kept it because I knew the room would rush toward the wrong story before morning. I was waiting to know whether anyone in this house would understand what it actually was." Ashcroft stepped forward and took the sleeve. "You should have surrendered this immediately." "Yes," Julia said, "but then you would all have read it as motive. It was method." Edward nodded once. "Correct." Ashcroft looked through the plastic, then back up. "Mr. Rohe, this is your dictation?" "Yes." "It concerns Vivian's private medical treatment?" "Yes." Mira closed her eyes. Daniel went pale. Clara looked suddenly deeply tired. Edward spoke softly now, because the room no longer needed force. Vivian was not preparing to expose a crime. She was preparing to expose trust. She intended to take a man's most vulnerable words, strip them of context, reveal them in front of the woman inheriting her archive, and let the room do the rest. No one argued, because now, with the page visible and the poison confirmed, the architecture of the evening stood exposed in all its mean precision. Vivian had written a final chapter. Julia had cut one page from it.
And in the half-second where the story stopped obeying its author, the dead woman had reached for the wrong certainty. Edward looked around the room one last time. "No one here is innocent," he said. "That is not the same thing as saying one of you murdered her. Vivian built a trap, loaded it, and lost control of the mechanism. Julia prevented one destruction. Elias enabled that prevention. Owen saw the sequence. Clara saw the emotional geometry. Daniel and Mira did what audiences do best. They supplied motive faster than fact." Daniel looked offended. Mira looked as though she wanted to be. Edward didn't care. Ashcroft closed the evidence sleeve around the recovered page. "That will do," she said. No one moved. Then, slowly, the room began to release itself. Mira sat down hard for the first time all day. Daniel looked not relieved, but embarrassed by how much interpretation he had mistaken for relevance. Clara closed her eyes and opened them again, as if filing the entire case under a heading she would never share publicly. Owen exhaled once, the sound of a man whose private sequence had finally found its report. Elias remained still, but not tense now. Julia, by the window, looked at the city rather than the table, as if the table had finally lost the right to define her angle. Edward turned to go. At the door he stopped. "Vivian Voss did get her final chapter," he said without turning back, "just not the one she meant to publish." Then he left the dining room, the manuscript, the page, the poisoned place setting, and the 6 surviving editors of the evening behind him. By sunset, the city would already be telling the worse version, that the novelist had died at the hands of one of her former assistants. It was cleaner that way, but clean stories were often false. The true ending was narrower and crueler. A woman who believed she could weaponize memory one final time had discovered, too late, that the most dangerous revision in the room was not death. She built the trap herself. She arranged the guests. She prepared the final reveal, and still she lost control of the ending. If you enjoy modern detective stories in the spirit of Sherlock Holmes, subscribe to the channel. The next case is already waiting.